I've got to do something. I remember thinking that I've got to work. And that kept me up.
95 years old, still sharp, still standing. And after decades of carefully chosen words and carefully managed silences, William Shatner finally broke. Not in the way celebrities break, no tearful apology, no damage control press tour. He simply sat down, started talking, and stopped performing. What came out was 60 years of buried truth about one of the most famous television sets in history, about the people on it, about the man running it, and about what it actually cost the man the whole world knew as Captain Kirk. Fans thought they knew this story. They didn't know anything. The man behind the captain.
Except every time I hear the number 95, I go, who's 95 here?
Before the uniform, before the catchphrases, before the conventions and the commemorative plates and the Lifetime Achievement Awards, William Shatner was just a young man from Montreal who wanted desperately to be taken seriously as an actor. And that desire, that raw, almost painful hunger for legitimacy, would quietly shape everything that followed across the next 7 decades of his life. He was born on March 22, 1931, into a middle-class Jewish family in Canada. And from the very beginning, he moved like someone who had somewhere important to be. He studied at McGill University, trained seriously in theater, and by his mid-20s had already built a respectable stage career on both sides of the Atlantic, performing Shakespeare and classical drama at a level that made serious critics take notice. This was not a man stumbling toward fame. This was a man with a plan, with discipline, and with a level of theatrical ambition that his peers found both admirable and quietly intimidating. And then Hollywood came calling, and everything got complicated. His early film work showed real promise, and his performance in the 1961 film Judgment at Nuremberg reminded everyone who watched it that there was genuine depth behind the charisma. Directors noticed. Studios noticed. For a brief electric moment, it looked like William Shatner was going to become one of the defining dramatic actors of his generation. The kind of career that ends with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and a seat at the serious table, not the celebrity one. But the industry has a way of making other plans for people, and the role that would consume the next 60 years of his identity arrived not as a triumph, but almost as a consolation prize, though nobody could have known that at the time. When Star Trek premiered on NBC on September 8, 1966, Shatner was 35 years old, recently divorced, financially stretched, and looking for steady work in a television landscape that was rapidly expanding and desperate for leading men who could carry a series. And he brought to James Tiberius Kirk everything he had: the physicality, the charisma, the theatrical training, the emotional intelligence, and the character came alive in a way that felt genuinely electric to audiences who had never seen anything quite like it on their television screens before. The problem was that Captain Kirk was almost too good, too iconic, too perfectly matched to Shatner's specific energy in a way that made it nearly impossible for the industry to imagine him as anything else. And that trap closed around him so gradually and so completely that by the time he fully understood what had happened, the door had already sealed shut behind him. Here is what most people never stop to consider about those early Star Trek years, and this is where the story starts to get genuinely complicated. Shatner was the lead of the show, the face on the promotional material, the name above the title, and yet inside that production, on that set, in those long days of filming on the Des Salutes lot in Hollywood, he was navigating a set of dynamics that were far more turbulent than anything beaming down to a hostile planet, because the relationships between the cast members were not what they appeared to be on screen, and the studio machinery surrounding them all was operating with an agenda that none of them fully understood until it was far too late to push back against it effectively. He was surrounded by extraordinarily talented people, several of whom resented the hierarchy the show had established before a single frame was ever shot, and that resentment did not stay politely in the background where it might have been manageable. It seeped into rehearsals and into dailies and into the quiet conversations that happened just out of earshot of the producers, and Shatner, competitive, ambitious, hyper-aware of every shift in the room's energy, felt all of it without ever having a safe place to put it or a person he could fully trust with it. He kept performing, he kept showing up, He kept playing the most confident man in the galaxy while quietly absorbing tensions and pressures that would have broken a less stubborn human being. And the smile he wore in every publicity photo from that era was real enough on the surface, but built on a foundation far more complicated than it looked. What was actually happening on that set was something he would carry silently for 60 years. And the weight of it, it turns out, was almost unbearable. What was really happening on the Star Trek set? There is a version of the Star Trek story that has been told so many times it has almost become mythology. The one where a visionary creator assembled a brilliant cast, where the chemistry was instant and genuine, where the bridge of the Enterprise was a place of creative harmony and mutual respect, and where everyone went home at the end of the shooting day feeling like they were part of something important and historic. And that version is not entirely false, but it is nowhere near the complete picture, and William Shatner knew it better than anyone. The tension started almost immediately, and it started where tension almost always starts in Hollywood, with billing, with screen time, and with the quiet, corrosive question of who actually mattered most to the people signing the checks. And that question had an answer that not everyone on the cast was comfortable accepting, because the answer was always, unmistakably, William Shatner, and the man sitting closest to that uncomfortable truth was Leonard Nimoy. Nimoy was extraordinary. Everyone on that production knew it, including Shatner, and to his credit, Shatner has never pretended otherwise across any of the decades of interviews he has given about this period of his life. But knowing that someone is extraordinary, and being comfortable with the specific way that extraordinary person begins to overshadow, you are two very different emotional experiences. And the relationship between Kirk and Spock on screen, that perfectly calibrated push and pull between logic and instinct, between restraint and passion, was fueled in no small part by a real and genuinely complicated rivalry that existed just beneath the surface of every scene they shared together. Nimoy's fan mail began outpacing Shatner's early in the first season, and that shift did not go unnoticed by the network, by the producers, or by Shatner himself, who was acutely aware of every metric that measured his standing on the show, because his standing on the show was the one thing standing between him and another period of financial instability that he had no desire to revisit. And so, the competition between them, though rarely explosive or publicly dramatic, was constant and exhausting, and shaped nearly every creative decision, either man-made throughout the 3 seasons they filmed together. DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy, watched all of it from a position of relative emotional safety, being the third point in the triangle rather than one of its 2 competing peaks. And in later interviews, Kelley was carefully diplomatic about what he witnessed, choosing his words with the kind of precision that suggested he understood exactly how much damage the uncareful version of those words could do, which itself tells you something important about the atmosphere that existed behind those sliding doors and transporter pads and cardboard alien landscapes on the Desilu lot. But the cast dynamics, as bruising as they sometimes were, represented only one layer of what Shatner was navigating during those years, because above all of them sat Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the show, a man of genuine visionary intelligence and also of considerable personal complexity. And his relationship with Shatner was one of the most layered and least publicly examined dynamics in the entire history of the production, stretching from deep mutual respect in the early days all the way through periods of real friction as the show evolved and the question of creative ownership became increasingly contested territory between them. Roddenberry had a specific vision for Kirk, for the show, for what science fiction television could be and should be, and Shatner had his own instincts about performance and character that did not always align perfectly with that vision. And the space between those 2 sets of instincts was sometimes generative and sometimes genuinely combative, and navigating it required Shatner to constantly balance his own artistic judgment against the political reality that Roddenberry was the one with the creator credit and the studio relationships and the ability to make a leading man's life on set significantly more difficult if he chose to do so. And then there was what the studio itself was doing to all of them, the budget constraints that were dressed up as creative decisions, the scheduling pressures that left cast members exhausted and short-tempered in ways that inevitably spilled into their interactions with each other, the network interference that Roddenberry fought against constantly, and that trickled down onto the set as a kind of low-grade institutional anxiety that everyone absorbed without quite being able to name its source. and Shatner stood in the middle of all of it, day after day, episode after episode, holding the whole volatile thing together through sheer force of professional will. He never talked about any of it publicly. Not really, not the way it actually was. But the silence, as it turns out, had a cost that nobody fully understood until much later. The years of silence and what they cost him. When Star Trek was canceled in 1969 after just 3 seasons, William Shatner walked off that set, carrying something that no amount of fan devotion or syndication royalties could adequately compensate for. And it was not just the loss of steady work or the professional uncertainty that follows the end of any long-running production, but something heavier and more personal than that. Something that had accumulated slowly across 3 years of navigating rivalries and studio politics, and the quiet, grinding pressure of being the face of something much larger than himself, while feeling increasingly invisible as a human being beneath the costume. The years that followed were brutal in a way that Hollywood rarely acknowledges honestly about its own casualties, because the industry is far more comfortable celebrating comebacks than examining the conditions that made them necessary in the first place. And what happened to Shatner in the 1970s was a slow-motion unraveling that would have permanently ended a less resilient man's career and possibly his sense of self entirely, because the roles that he had every reason to expect after 3 seasons of leading one of the most talked about shows on American television simply did not materialize in any meaningful way. And the phone that should have been ringing with offers from directors who wanted that energy, that presence, that undeniable screen magnetism, went largely and humiliatingly quiet. He lost his house. He lost financial stability that he had worked his entire adult life to build. And in one of the most startling details from this entire chapter of his story, there was a period during the early 1970s when William Shatner, Captain Kirk, the man who had commanded a starship and captured the imagination of millions of viewers across the world, was living out of a truck, sleeping in the cab, doing whatever regional theater work he could find to keep himself afloat, while the industry that had made him famous moved efficiently and without sentiment onto the next thing, the way it always does. And through all of it, through every humiliation and every financial anxiety and every moment of sitting in that truck, wondering how his career had arrived at this particular destination, he did not go public with what he knew about the years on that set. Did not sit down with a journalist and start naming names or settling scores or offering the kind of insider revelations that would have guaranteed him front-page coverage and a temporary return to the spotlight that his bank account desperately needed at the time. And that restraint, that almost stubborn commitment to silence, is one of the most revealing things about the man when you examine it closely enough. The question worth asking is why, because silence of that duration and that consistency is never accidental, and it is never entirely comfortable. And the easy answer is that he was protecting his reputation, or protecting his chances of a comeback. But the more honest answer is considerably more complicated than that. Because Shatner was protecting relationships that mattered to him even when those relationships were causing him pain. And he was protecting a version of Star Trek that he understood belonged not just to him, or to Nimoy, or to Roddenberry, but to the millions of people who had made it part of their lives in a way that none of the cast members had fully anticipated or entirely understood how to manage. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else connected to that production, that the mythology surrounding Star Trek was fragile in a specific way, that it depended on a certain image of harmony and shared purpose that did not entirely reflect the reality of what had happened between those people on that set, and that puncturing that image too aggressively or too publicly would damage something that genuinely mattered to an enormous number of human beings who had found real comfort and inspiration and community in that universe. And he was not willing to be the person responsible for that damage, even at significant personal cost. But silence is not the same as peace, and carrying a truth for 60 years without being able to fully set it down takes a toll on a person that shows up in ways that are not always immediately visible, in the careful way he constructed his public persona across the decades, in the performances within performances that fans and interviewers consistently sensed without being able to precisely identify. In the moments during convention panels and documentary interviews where something would flicker across his face for just a fraction of a second before the professional mask settled back into place with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it for longer than most people had been alive. Something eventually had to give. And at 95 years old, with more of his life behind him than ahead, it finally did. The moment he decided to talk. There is a specific kind of freedom that arrives only at the far end of a long life, and it is not the freedom of youth, which is mostly just ignorance wearing a confident expression, but something quieter and more considered than that. A freedom that comes from having outlived most of the people who might have been hurt by the truth, and from having finally made a separate peace with the distance between the story you told the world and the story you actually lived. And William Shatner arrived at that freedom gradually, and then, in the way these things often happen, all at once. The first visible crack in the carefully maintained wall appeared not in an interview or a memoir, but 60 miles above the surface of the Earth on October 13th, 2021, when Shatner became the oldest human being ever to travel to space aboard Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin rocket. And what happened to him up there was something that neither he nor the people around him were fully prepared for. Because instead of the exhilaration and triumph that everyone expected from a man who had spent decades pretending to travel among the stars, what Shatner actually experienced in that moment of genuine spaceflight was overwhelming grief, a profound and destabilizing sadness that he described afterward with a raw honesty that stopped people in their tracks and signaled clearly to anyone paying close attention that something fundamental had shifted inside him. He stood on the landing site afterward with tears streaming down his face and spoke about the fragility of the thin blue line of atmosphere protecting everything alive on Earth, about the terrifying emptiness of space beyond it, about the grief of understanding viscerally and physically, for the first time, what it meant that human beings were systematically destroying the only living world in an infinite dead universe. And it was a speech that sounded nothing like Captain Kirk and nothing like the performance version of William Shatner that the public had been consuming for 6 decades. And that was precisely what made it so arresting and so significant. Because it was just a man, shaken and unguarded, saying something true without first checking whether it was the right thing to say. That moment opened a door that Shatner apparently decided he was not going to close again, and the evidence of that decision began accumulating in the months and years that followed, in ways that were subtle at first, and then increasingly unmistakable to the journalists and documentarians and fellow actors who found themselves sitting across from him in interview settings that suddenly felt different from every previous conversation they had managed to have with him, because he was no longer navigating those conversations with the same careful diplomatic architecture that had characterized his public appearances for most of his adult life. The deaths of his colleagues had also done their quiet work on him across the years, because Leonard Nimoy passed away in February of 2015 after a long struggle with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and DeForest Kelley had been gone since 1999, and James Doohan since 2005, and Nichelle Nichols since 2022. And with each passing, the circle of people who shared first-hand knowledge of what had actually happened on that set grew smaller, and the responsibility of being among the last remaining witnesses to that specific chapter of television history grew correspondingly heavier and more urgent in a way that Shatner has spoken about, with a directness that is difficult to listen to without being genuinely moved by it. He began writing with a new kind of honesty. His memoir, Boldly Go, published in October of 2022, reading in places like a document that a younger version of himself would never have been willing to sign his name to, touching on regrets and failures and relational wounds with a specificity and a vulnerability that surprised readers who thought they already knew everything there was to know about this man. And the book's reception confirmed what the space journey had first suggested, which was that audiences were hungry for the real Shatner in a way they had perhaps not even known until he finally started offering glimpses of him. Interviewers who sat with him during the promotional period around that book have described the experience in remarkably similar terms, noting that he seemed lighter somehow, less defended, more willing to let a silence sit without rushing to fill it with performance, more comfortable with the discomfort of honesty than he had ever previously appeared to be. And several of them noted that there were moments during those conversations where he would pause before answering a question in a way that suggested he was making a real-time decision about how much of the truth he was finally willing to put into the world. At 95 years old, having buried friends and survived heartbreak and watched the mythology he helped create outlast almost everything else in his life, William Shatner had apparently decided that the remaining time was too short and too precious to spend any more of it protecting a version of events that had never been entirely true. And so he started talking. The truth he finally revealed. When William Shatner finally lowered the carefully constructed wall that had stood between his public persona and his private reality for 60 years, what emerged was not a single dramatic confession delivered in one sitting, but rather a series of revelations that accumulated across interviews and memoir pages and unguarded conversational moments into something that collectively amounted to the most honest portrait of life inside the Star Trek universe that any of its principal architects had ever been willing to provide. And the picture that portrait revealed was simultaneously more human and more painful than the mythology had ever allowed for. The first thing he addressed with new and striking candor was the relationship with Leonard Nimoy, which he had spent decades describing in carefully balanced terms that acknowledged the tension without ever fully excavating it, but which he now discussed with a directness that made clear just how much of the real story had been left on the cutting room floor of every previous conversation on the subject. What existed between those two men was not simply professional rivalry or creative competition, but something more psychologically complex than either of those neat categories can adequately contain. A relationship that Shatner described as the most important and most painful creative partnership of his entire life, and one that he grieved in ways he had never previously admitted to in public. He revealed that there were extended periods during the production of the original series when he and Nimoy were not speaking off camera in any meaningful way, that the warmth and easy chemistry visible in their scenes together was a testament to the professionalism of both men rather than a reflection of what was actually happening between them in the corridors and dressing rooms of the Desilu lot, and that the specific source of the fracture was more nuanced than simple jealousy, rooted instead in a mutual sense that each man was not receiving from the other the recognition and respect that his contribution to the show deserved, a dynamic that fed on itself across 3 seasons in ways that left both of them carrying wounds that never entirely healed, even across the decades of reconciliation and convention appearances and public declarations of mutual admiration that followed the show's cancellation. What Shatner said about Gene Roddenberry was perhaps even more startling, given how carefully the creator's legacy has been managed and protected in the decades since his death in 1991. Because Shatner's account of his relationship with Roddenberry moved well beyond the respectful disagreements that had occasionally been acknowledged in previous interviews into territory that painted a picture of a man whose visionary creativity existed alongside a controlling and sometimes manipulative management style that created a working environment on that set which was far more psychologically demanding than the show's optimistic philosophy about human potential would ever have suggested to outside observers. He spoke about specific instances where Roddenberry used his position as creator to undermine cast members who challenged his authority or questioned his decisions, about the way that creative credit was allocated and withheld as a form of control, and about the profound disillusionment of working for a man whose public message was about the limitless possibility of human cooperation, while his private conduct sometimes reflected a far more competitive and territorial understanding of how power actually worked. And Shatner delivered these observations not with bitterness, but with the measured, almost clinical clarity of a man who has spent decades processing an experience and arrived finally at a place of genuine understanding that exists somewhere beyond the reach of simple resentment. But the revelations that landed with the most emotional weight were not about Nimoy or Roddenberry or the studio politics or the billing disputes, but about what the role of Captain Kirk had done to William Shatner as a private human being across the 60 years since he first put on that gold uniform and stepped onto that bridge. Because what he described was a process of identity erosion so gradual and so complete that he had spent the better part of his adult life genuinely uncertain about where Kirk ended and Shatner began, uncertain about which of his instincts and reactions and ways of moving through the world belonged to him, and which had been assembled by a television character that the public needed him to keep performing regardless of what was happening in his actual life. He spoke with devastating honesty about his marriages, 3 of which ended in divorce, and about the ways in which the demands of the Kirk persona and everything that came with it had made genuine intimacy consistently difficult for him, had made it hard for the people closest to him to reach the real man beneath the performance because the performance had become so deeply embedded in his daily functioning that even he could not always locate the boundary between the two with any reliable precision. And he said this not as an excuse or a deflection, but as a simple and sorrowful fact about the price that a certain kind of fame extracts from a person over a long enough period of time. He also admitted something that no amount of awards or fan devotion or cultural legacy had ever been able to fully address, which was the specific loneliness of being the most visible person in a room while simultaneously feeling the least seen, of spending 3 years at the center of one of the most beloved productions in television history, while carrying private burdens that he could share with no one on that set, without the information being weaponized in ways that would have made an already volatile situation significantly worse than it already was. He said the set was not what people imagined it to be, that the optimism beaming out of television screens every week bore only a partial resemblance to the atmosphere in which it was being created, and that the gap between those two realities was something he had protected for 60 years. Out of love for what Star Trek meant to the world, even when that protection came at considerable cost to his own peace of mind and his own ability to tell his story on his own terms. And sitting there at 95 years old, finally unburdened of it, he looked, by every account of everyone present, like a man who had just set down something extraordinarily heavy and was only now, for the first time in 6 decades, learning what it felt like to stand fully upright without it. 95 years. That is how long it took for the full truth to find its way out of William Shatner and into the world where it always belonged. Not because he was weak, but because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, the difference between a story that belongs to you and a story that belongs to millions of people who needed it to be something specific. He gave the world Captain Kirk for 60 years. And then, finally, he gave the world himself. Some truths are worth waiting for. This one certainly was. If this story moved you, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you think someone else needs to hear this, share it. They do.